There's a saying that echoes through the halls of time, beware the quiet ones, for they carry the deepest storms. In the shadows they listen, they observe, and they learn. We see them as harmless, perhaps even wise, for they appear calm, distant from the chaos. You see, we must be cautious, especially for those who sleep, for when a giant stirs, when a force of unimaginable power awakens, it does not rise with patience. It rises with fury. It rises with vengeance. Once there was a being who embraced wisdom and balance, content to remain in the shadows. But when that balance was disturbed, that quiet wisdom turned to destruction. A sleeping giant awoke, and the world trembled beneath his wrath. This is the tale of the sage, calm before the storm, quiet giant turned destroyer.
In the heart of Central Europe, deep within the shadowed lands of Velgarth, stood the estate of the ancient vampire known as the Sage. The mid-15th century was an era of fear and uncertainty, yet the estate itself was a fortress of serenity amidst the chaos. Encircled by towering forests and forgotten by time, it was a place untouched by the wars of men or the ravages of the world. The great manor, a looming structure of blackened stone, had stood for centuries, untouched by any mortal hand. Within, in the deepest chamber of the estate, the sage lay in a deep, ancient sleep. His stillness was eerie, as if death itself had taken him. But for an elder such as he, this slumber was vital. The elder's sleep, as it was called, was a time of rejuvenation, a moment where the eternal creatures of the night could restore their essence and strengthen their connection to the supernatural realms. Here the sage, whose mind held the secrets of the cosmos, rested, his mind floating between the ethereal planes. A soft but persistent knock echoed through the stone corridors, growing louder as it travelled. The heavy doors to the chamber creaked open, and an elder vampire entered, his presence radiating power and command. His name was Valdric, a fellow ancient, but unknown to the sage. This elder concealed a far darker identity. He was Dr. Thorn, son of the vampire god Nocturna, banished long ago for unspeakable deeds. Cloaked in his disguise, he approached the sage with measured steps, his face hidden, masking the cruel intent that lay within his heart. "The sage," Valdric's voice called, low and commanding. "Awaken. The elders are in dire need of you." The sage stirred, his body shifting slightly as his mind returned from the deep sleep. His eyes opened slowly, golden irises glowing faintly in the darkened room, reflecting both the power and wisdom he carried. He sat up, though weariness clung to his ancient bones. The sleep had done its work, but the grogginess lingered. He gazed at Valdric with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Valdric," the sage spoke slowly, his voice soft but commanding. "What event could be so dire that you disturb the elder's sleep?" Valdric stepped forward, his tone grave. "The humans have grown bold. They have discovered the Elder's sanctuaries and hunted them down. Our kin are near extinction." The sage blinked, processing the words carefully. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice filled with the weight of centuries of knowledge. "Humans could never achieve such a feat. This is not mere coincidence or mortal strength. There must be more at play here, something unseen. We must not act in haste. To act rashly would be to fall into a trap. But before the sage could rise, Valdric placed a hand on his shoulder, a subtle smile playing on his lips as he did so. The touch was unnatural, and as his hand made contact, a strange glow emanated from Valdric's palm. The energy surged into the sage, powerful and foreign, creeping into his very soul. It was a dark energy, one that was not of the Elder's kind. For a split second, Valdric's true face was revealed, the face of Dr. Thorne, the son of Nocturna. Twisted and menacing, before his disguise quickly reformed. The sage, however, did not notice the brief glimpse of truth. What he did notice was the overwhelming power that flooded his being. His wisdom, his calm, his reason, it all began to dissolve, replaced by an insidious rage, a hunger for vengeance that clawed at his once balanced mind. His golden eyes darkened as the energy surged through him. "How dare they?" he bellowed, his voice shaking the very walls of the chamber. His fury was palpable, each word dripping with malice and wrath. "How dare these miserable creatures challenge us? They shall pay dearly for their arrogance." He rose now, fully awakened, but no longer the calm and wise elder he once was. His entire being was consumed by a singular, terrifying thought: vengeance. His voice thundered through the chamber as he declared, "I shall bring upon a vengeance not seen by this world. I shall wipe the miserable humans from this planet, and in their place our kin shall reign supreme." Valdric, Dr. Thorne, smiled, watching as the sage's fury ignited like wildfire. The manipulation had worked, and now the sage, the once wise leader, had become a weapon of destruction, fueled by anger, rage and bloodlust. His pledge echoed through the chamber like a dark prophecy. "I shall not stop," the sage snarled, "until the elders reign supreme." And thus, the first seeds of ruin were sown. The sage, blind to the dark force manipulating him, prepared to unleash a reign of terror that would forever stain the world of both humans and vampires alike, manipulated by Dr. Thorne for his own dark purposes. Valdric strode through the stone halls of the estate, the echo of the sage's furious declaration still reverberating off the walls. His grin widened, lips curling into a twisted smile as he distanced himself from the awakened elder. His gait was smooth, almost effortless, as if he floated just above the cold ground. He relished the sound of his steps, each one a step closer to the chaos he had orchestrated. As he passed through a dimly lit archway, his face began to shift. The skin rippled, distorting and pulling back like wax melting under a flame. The elder vampire visage melted away, revealing his true form, Dr. Thorne. His eyes glowed a crimson red, his fangs elongated and sharp as daggers. His face, no longer the calm and aged appearance of an elder, now displayed the cruel sharpness of a predator. He glanced around the estate one last time, a sinister laugh escaping his throat. "Oh, dear father," he mused, speaking softly to the darkness around him. "What will happen when the balance is tipped, when no humans remain for the lichens or the undead to prey upon? How will you explain this to Lysana, the great god of the lichens, and to Necros, lord of the undead?" He chuckled, savouring the thought of the chaos he was about to unleash upon the world. "This is going to be so much fun." With a final satisfied smirk, Dr. Thorne disappeared into the shadows, leaving the estate and the fury of the sage behind. The sky over Velgath had darkened, thick clouds obscuring the moon, casting the land in a heavy gloom. Beneath the cover of night, the sage moved with terrifying purpose. His long, dark cloak billowed behind him, blending into the blackness as he crossed the land. His movement, a silent whisper in the wind, The once wise and restrained elder was now nothing more than a vessel for rage, driven by a singular thought: destruction. He moved through the dense forests, each step silent, each motion graceful yet predatory. His golden eyes, once filled with wisdom, were now ablaze with fury. His hands twitched with anticipation, longing for the blood of those who dared challenge his kind. His plan was simple: cull the humans, and for those worthy enough, convert them. The time had come for the elders to become the dominant species, ruling over the broken world left behind. Ahead, in the valley below, the first village lay quiet and peaceful, its inhabitants blissfully unaware of the terror that approached. The village was small, built of thatched roofs and cobbled streets, surrounded by farmlands that stretched out like fingers into the wilderness. It was a place untouched by war, its people humble and content. But tonight, their serenity would be shattered. The sage stood at the edge of the village, a towering figure, cloaked in darkness. His eyes scanned the sleeping homes, the flicker of torchlight, casting faint glows through the windows. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of human life, their sweat, their breath, their vulnerability. He could hear their heartbeats even from this distance, each one pulsing like a drumbeat in his ears, fueling the fire within him. He stepped forward, blending into the shadows that danced along the village streets. His approach was silent, his presence undetectable, as he moved between the houses like a spectre of death. There was no defense, no barrier to stop him. The humans had no idea what was descending upon them. The sage's mind raced, the power within him growing with each passing moment. His teeth bared in anticipation, and his voice, once wise and calm, now echoed in his mind with terrifying resolve. "These creatures, they are nothing," he thought, his anger intensifying. "Their blood will feed the elders, their lives sacrificed to rebuild our supremacy. The elders shall rise once again, and this land will be ours." He paused at the first house, his hand hovering over the door. The wooden frame creaked softly under the weight of his aura. He could hear the soft breathing of the family inside. A mother, a father, 2 children. His lips curled into a vicious smile. This was only the beginning. The sage raised his hand, prepared to strike, prepared to fulfill the terrible pledge he had made. The night would soon run red with blood, and his reign of terror had only just begun. The father stirred, his eyes fluttering open for the briefest moment before he saw it. The sage, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness, his face a mask of cold, unrelenting fury. There was no scream, no chance to cry out. The sage moved faster than human eyes could follow, his hand wrapping around the man's throat, silencing him instantly. His fangs sank deep into the man's neck, drawing blood in a torrent. The man's life drained in seconds, his body crumpling to the floor like a discarded puppet. The sage rose, his lips slick with crimson, the taste of blood igniting a deeper hunger within him. The mother awoke to the sight of her husband's lifeless form, her scream cut short as the sage turned to her. She backed away in terror, her eyes wide, but there was no escape. He was upon her in an instant, his hand clamping over her mouth, muffling her terrified cries. His other hand tore through her chest with monstrous strength, the sound of bone and flesh ripping apart in the darkness. Blood spattered across the room, painting the walls with the horror of the night. The children, too young to understand the nightmare unfolding before them, had no time to cry. The sage's wrath was swift, merciless, as he dispatched them with terrifying efficiency. Their small bodies lay still, their blood soaking into the wooden floorboards. The house, once full of warmth and life, was now cold and silent, the scent of death heavy in the air. But the sage was not satisfied. This was only the beginning. He moved through the village like a phantom, slipping from house to house, his hunger growing with every kill. He tore through families, men, women, and children alike, sparing no one. His hands dripped with blood, his cloak soaked in the lives he had extinguished. His movements were swift, his attacks brutal and unrelenting. The villagers were helpless, caught in the grip of an ancient, unstoppable force. Doors were smashed open, walls splintered as he moved with supernatural strength. No one was safe from his fury. The once peaceful village was turned into a slaughterhouse, the cries of the dying barely reaching the ears of those still alive, as the sage's shadow consumed them all. The village burned as he set fire to the homes of those he did not deem worthy of conversion. Flames rose into the sky, licking at the heavens, as the screams of the dying faded into the night. The sky itself seemed to mourn the loss, the wind howling in protest as smoke billowed upward, carrying the scent of charred flesh and destruction. As dawn neared, the sage stood at the center of the village, his eyes surveying the devastation. The streets ran red with blood, bodies strewn across the cobblestones like broken dolls. The scent of death hung thick in the air, mingling with the smoke from the burning homes. He had culled the village, as he had sworn to do, his rage still bubbling beneath the surface. But for those few he had spared, those he had deemed worthy of joining the elders' ranks, they lay in the wreckage of their homes, their bodies twisted and broken as they began their painful transformation. They would rise soon as new elders, adding to the ranks of the undead, the sage's army, the foundation of his new world order. He turned and disappeared into the shadows once again, leaving behind the smouldering remains of the village, a testament to his vengeance and the dark path he had been set upon. The night would never be the same. The nights bled together in an unending tide of horror as the sage continued his merciless culling of village after village. Each dawn revealed smouldering ruins, blood-soaked streets, and bodies drained of life. Entire regions had gone silent, the once thriving villages reduced to ash and bone. For those who had survived the first attacks, the rumours began to spread. An unstoppable force was sweeping across the land, bringing a terror more fearsome than any war or famine. Whispers of a plague began to circulate, one that devoured entire towns and left nothing but death in its wake. But it was no plague. It was something far worse. Weeks passed, and the sage did not relent. His army of elders had grown to monstrous proportions, bursting with power, their ranks swelling with the newly turned. What had once been a handful of ancient vampires was now an unstoppable legion, thousands of undead marching under the sage's command. But even he, in his fury, knew that the balance had tipped. With so many to feed, the human population was dwindling at an alarming rate. At this pace, humanity would be extinct in mere months. In the great hall of Castellan Keep, the lord of the land, Lord Gregor of Vilmar, sat at the head of a long stone table. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, but it did little to warm the heavy atmosphere that hung over the room. His counsellors were gathered around him, their faces pale with fear, their voices hushed as they discussed the growing threat outside their gates. "My lord," began Marek, the oldest of his counsellors, his voice trembling slightly. "The villages to the east have gone dark. No word from their people in weeks. It is said they are gone. All of them." Gregor's eyes narrowed. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "There are rumours, my lord," Marek continued. "Rumours of a terrible force moving through the land. Some believe it is a sickness. Others say it is something far more sinister. They speak of creatures in the night, shadows that drain the life from men, women, and children alike." "A plague, then?" Gregor asked. trying to maintain a calm demeanour, though his fingers gripped the armrests of his chair with white-knuckled force. Bertrand, a younger counsellor, shook his head. "It is no plague, my lord. The survivors we've questioned speak of monsters. Vampires, they call them. Elders. Beings of the night that drink the blood of the living. But these are mere superstitions, aren't they?" Gregor rose from his seat, his gaze moving over the anxious faces of his counsellors. "Superstitions or not, something is killing my people. This cannot go unchecked. If this continues, Vilmar will be a wasteland. We must act." A silence fell over the room as the counsellors exchanged uneasy glances. None dared to speak the truth aloud, but the signs were unmistakable. Villages reduced to hushed ruins, corpses drained of blood, the terrifying whispers of an army of undead growing larger by the day. Gregor slammed his fist on the table, the noise jolting everyone from their thoughts. "Whatever this is, plague or monsters, we will meet it with steel and fire. Prepare the army. Vilmar will not fall while I still draw breath." Outside the keep, preparations for war began in earnest. The clang of metal echoed through the fortress as blacksmiths worked day and night to forge new weapons. The barracks were filled with soldiers, hardened veterans and fresh recruits alike, donning their armor and sharpening their swords. The banners of Vilmar flew high, their bright colors a stark contrast to the growing sense of dread that hung over the land. In the ranks of men, whispers spread like wildfire, the stories they had heard in the taverns by campfires and in hushed tones grew more grotesque with every telling. Some claimed to have seen the monsters firsthand, pale figures with eyes that glowed like embers, moving silently through the night, leaving entire villages drained of life. Others spoke of the undead rising from their graves, twisted abominations marching in endless numbers. "Vampires," one soldier muttered, his face pale beneath his helm. "They say they're vampires. Not just a few, but thousands. Undead more like," another added, sharpening his sword with a steady hand. "Either way, we're facing something not of this world." Despite the grim chatter, the men prepared for battle. Lord Gregor had summoned the full might of his forces, an army that would sweep across the land to confront this growing threat. Thousands of men, knights, archers and foot soldiers gathered in the courtyards and beyond, their faces set with grim determination. Though many feared what awaited them, they would fight for their homes, their families, and for survival. Far to the east, on the outskirts of a distant village, a scene of pure horror unfolded. The countryside was a wasteland of scorched earth and ruined homes. A black tide of death moved across the land, the army of elders, their numbers now swelling to thousands. They marched in perfect silence, their pale faces devoid of emotion, their eyes glowing with the hunger of the undead. Their once human forms had long since been twisted by the curse of vampirism, their movements fluid and terrifying, like shadows given form. At their head, the sage strode forward, his eyes blazing with malevolent purpose. Cloaked in darkness, he was the very embodiment of death. His once calculated wisdom had been replaced by a relentless thirst for destruction, his mind consumed by the fury that Dr. Thorne had ignited within him. Behind him, his army moved with deadly precision, crushing everything in their path. Fields, villages, and fortresses alike. No human force could stand against them, and soon nothing would remain. The villages they passed through were left in ruins. Nothing but hollow shells filled with the corpses of those too weak to flee. The elders moved without pause, their hunger never satisfied, as they tore through the land like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in their path. From his place at the front, the sage gazed ahead, his lips curling into a snarl. "They will know our power. They will know the wrath of the elders, and none shall be spared." As the armies of Vilmar prepared for battle, A dark cloud loomed on the horizon, an unstoppable force of death and destruction that even the bravest of men could not comprehend. The whispers among the soldiers grew louder as they sharpened their weapons and prepared to march. They say it's not just vampires, it's something worse. The undead. Can we even kill them? Doesn't matter. We fight or we die. And so, the army of Vilmar stood ready, their fate uncertain as they prepared to face the unimaginable. The army of Vilmar marched like an unstoppable wave across the land, their numbers so vast that it seemed the earth itself shook beneath their feet. Horses snorted and stamped, their hooves thundering on the hardened ground. The clank of armor and weapons filled the air as thousands of soldiers moved as one, a sea of steel and banners under the dull, cloud-covered sky. From the infantry to the mounted knights, the army stretched out over miles, a force so grand that it seemed to be the might of an entire nation in motion. Lord Gregor rode at the front, his warhorse draped in the colours of Vilmar. Behind him, his officers, pages, servants, and soldiers marched in orderly columns, all preparing for the confrontation that awaited them. The threat they faced was still shrouded in mystery, but none doubted the scale of the devastation that lay in their path. They had heard the rumours, vampires, undead, but few truly believed in such horrors. Even fewer were prepared for what awaited them. As the sun began to set on their third day of marching, the army made camp in a sprawling field that seemed to stretch to the horizon. It was an awe-inspiring sight. A vast city of makeshift tents and stables sprang up in hours, with fires flickering to life in the growing darkness. The soldiers ate their evening meals in hushed tones, sharpening their swords and stringing their bows. Pages and servants scurried about, tending to the needs of their lords and commanders, while officers gathered to discuss battle plans for the coming day. The camp was alive with the sounds of preparation, clinking armor and murmured conversations, the low hum of tension hanging in the air. Though none spoke of it openly, there was a creeping sense of unease, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. They knew that when the dawn came, they would face something monstrous, something beyond their understanding, but the dawn would never come for them. As the night deepened and the fires dimmed, the army fell into a fitful sleep. The sky above was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. A stillness settled over the camp, broken only by the occasional murmur of guards on patrol or the rustle of wind through the tents. Then, without warning, a wave of death descended upon them. Out of the darkness, thousands of shadows moved with blistering speed, faster than any human eye could follow. The first patrol was dead before they even knew they had been attacked. The elders, ancient vampires, twisted by time and power, moved through the camp like a plague of death. Their forms nothing more than dark blurs in the night. Their pale faces flashed briefly in the dim firelight as they descended upon the unsuspecting soldiers, their fangs tearing into flesh, draining life in an instant. The camp erupted into chaos. Men screamed in terror as the elders struck with unrelenting fury. Tents were torn apart, weapons shattered, and bodies hit the ground with sickening thuds. The elders' strength was unimaginable, their movements fluid and graceful as they tore through the army without effort. Knights in heavy armor were tossed aside like rag dolls, their steel useless against the superior power of the undead. An officer shouted orders, trying to rally his men, but an elder appeared before him in a blur of motion. In the blink of an eye, the officer's throat was torn open, his blood spraying across the ground as he crumpled lifeless. The soldiers, unprepared and terrified, tried to fight back, but their swords and spears found no purchase. The elders were too fast, too strong. Arrows shot into the darkness, hit nothing but air, and those that did land were swatted aside with ease. Panic spread like wildfire. The once proud army of Vilmar, thousands strong, was reduced to chaos as the elders moved through them like a storm of death. Soldiers tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The elders hunted them down one by one, pulling them from the shadows, their screams echoing into the night before being silenced forever. The scene was one of pure horror. Tents were torn apart, the ground soaked with blood. The bodies of the fallen littered the field, drained and discarded, their faces frozen in terror. Horses, spooked by the scent of death, reared and screamed, but even they were no match for the relentless force that had descended upon them. In the midst of the slaughter, the sage stood at the heart of the battlefield, watching as his army of elders tore through the humans with ease. His golden eyes burned with malice as he surveyed the destruction. This was the vengeance he had sworn. This was the fate of humanity. His rage, once tempered by wisdom, had been unleashed in full. There was no stopping him now. As the last of the soldiers fell, their lifeblood spilling into the earth, the sage raised his hands to the sky. A dark energy swirled around him, and in that moment, the fallen began to stir. The once dead soldiers, drained of life, now rose from the ground. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light as they stood, their bodies twisted and corrupted, their humanity stripped away. They had become elders, part of the sage's unstoppable army. One by one, the newly turned elders joined their ranks, standing beside the ancient ones, their loyalty now bound to the sage. The vast army of Vilmar had been utterly destroyed, and in its place, a new force had risen, a force that would march across the world, wiping out all that remained of humanity. The sage stood at the center of the carnage, his hands raised, a dark smile spreading across his face as he gazed upon his new legion. The humans were powerless against him. They had no chance. This was the beginning of the end, the downfall of mankind. As the first rays of dawn tried to break through the clouds, they were swallowed by the darkness. There would be no hope for humanity, not while the sage walked the earth. His army was now complete, and nothing could stop him. The age of the elders had begun. The Watcher in the Storm. From a distant hilltop, shrouded in mist and shadow, Dr. Thorne watched the devastation unfold below. His crimson eyes glowed with satisfaction as he observed the last of Vilmar's army fall beneath the relentless assault of the sage and his army of elders. The camp, once teeming with life, was now a graveyard, the bodies of the fallen rising as undead warriors to join the ranks of the sage's dark legion. Dr. Thorne could hear the last desperate cries of the humans as they were snuffed out, their voices lost to the howling wind. He chuckled, his lips curling into a wicked smile. Impressive, Sage. Very impressive. The storm clouds above seemed to mirror the chaos on the ground, roiling and darkening as they churned through the night sky. Dr. Thorne's gaze shifted upward, his face illuminated by the distant flashes of lightning. His thoughts drifted to his father, Nocturna, the vampire god, the ancient being who had ruled over the balance of the supernatural world for eons. And now, the balance had been tipped. "Father," Dr. Thorne whispered, his voice laced with mockery. "Why have you allowed the elders to tip the balance? This is not the way." He raised his arms to the sky, addressing not only Nocturna, but the other gods who ruled over the supernatural realms, the ones who would feel the weight of the chaos that had been unleashed upon the world. "My lords," Dr. Thorne called out, his voice booming across the land, carried by the winds. "Necros, lord of the undead, Listenor, god of the lichens, I know not what my father plans, but you must stop him. The balance cannot be tipped. The sky above him responded. Thunder cracked like a whip, followed by a violent storm of lightning that tore across the heavens. The earth trembled beneath his feet as the sky seemed to rage, the storm a terrifying manifestation of the god's power. Bolts of lightning split the sky, casting the battlefield in eerie flashes of light. With each strike, the world seemed to pause for a heartbeat, revealing the scale of the devastation below. The broken bodies of Vilmar's soldiers, the newly risen elders, and the sage, standing amidst his dark army like a god of death. But as the storm raged, Dr. Thorne only smiled wider. Each flash of lightning illuminated the grin spreading across his face, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "When they dethrone you, Father," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but laced with malice, "I will be Lord." The storm intensified, thunder shaking the heavens, as if the gods themselves were locked in debate over the fate of the world below. Yet Dr. Thorne remained unmoved, basking in the chaos he had helped to create. His father had lost control. The sage had become a force of destruction, his army threatening to annihilate all of humanity and upset the delicate balance between the living and the dead, the lichens and the elders. But for Dr. Thorne, this was exactly as he had planned. He watched as the sage continued his march, his army now unstoppable, his wrath fueled by the dark power Thorne had ignited within him. And as the world burned, Dr. Thorne knew that his time would come, when the gods came to restore balance, when his father's failure became apparent. There would be a reckoning, and in that moment of chaos, Dr. Thorne would seize his throne. The storm raged on, but the smile never left Dr. Thorne's face. A glimpse of the past. The sage stood upon the battlefield, his dark cloak whipping in the wind, the air thick with the scent of blood and death. His golden eyes, once calm and wise, now blazed with fury and hatred. The remnants of the mighty army of Vilmar lay strewn around him, their bodies broken, drained, and twisted by the curse of vampirism. His army of elders, now swollen to monstrous numbers, stood behind him, an unstoppable force, ready to consume the world. The sage could feel the intoxicating surge of victory coursing through him, his mind consumed by a singular thought: power. The thunder above cracked like the roar of an angry god, but the sage's smile only deepened. He had won, and this was only the beginning. But as he stood there, reveling in his triumph, a memory clawed its way to the surface of his mind, a distant echo of who he once was. The scene shifted to a time long ago, a grand hall, deep within an ancient castle, lit by flickering candles and the soft glow of moonlight spilling through high-arched windows. The sage, younger but no less imposing, stood at the center of a gathering of vampires. They were elder vampires, like himself, ancient beings of immense power and wisdom. Their faces were stern, their eyes glowing with the weight of centuries. The sage was speaking, his voice calm and steady, yet filled with authority. He was not the wrathful figure he had become, but the most respected of the elders. His eyes, though sharp and predatory, held the wisdom of someone who had seen the rise and fall of empires. "We must not upset the balance," the sage declared, pacing slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "We are predators by nature, parasites who feed on the life force of others. But that does not mean we are without purpose. Our place is in the shadows, not in the light. We must remain hidden, away from the eyes of man. To reveal ourselves, to dominate them openly, would upset the natural order." The other elders watched him closely, hanging on his every word. They respected his wisdom, even feared it. The balance, the sage continued, is what keeps reality intact. The supernatural world, us, the lichens, the undead, we all have our place in it. But if any one of us tips that balance, if we push beyond the boundaries set by the natural order, reality itself will begin to unravel. A murmur passed through the gathered elders, but none dared challenge his words. "If we seek to dominate humanity," the sage said, his voice lowering to a more somber tone, "if we tip the scales too far in our favor, we shall all be destroyed. Reality will not sustain a world where one force is so far beyond the others. There must be equilibrium." The other elders nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They understood the gravity of his words. The sage had always been the wisest among them, a powerful figure whose knowledge of the supernatural realms surpassed them all. He understood that while they were predators, they were also bound by the rules of the universe. To break those rules was to invite destruction upon themselves. "Remember," the sage concluded, his eyes sweeping the room, "we live off the life of others, but we must never forget the need for balance. Without it, we shall all fall into ruin." The memory faded, and the sage was once again standing on the battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen. The storm above rumbled, the sky split open by flashes of lightning, but this time, the lesson he had once spoken with such certainty was lost, buried beneath the burning rage that now consumed him. His once clear understanding of balance, of the delicate order of reality, had been shattered by the dark power coursing through him. He looked down at his hands, now stained with the blood of thousands. The power, the destruction, it felt good. He had embraced the role of a conqueror, of a god among men. His mind, once filled with wisdom and restraint, was now driven by the insatiable hunger for dominance. "Balance," he muttered to himself, a dark grin creeping across his face. "There is no balance, only power." He raised his head, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. The battlefield was a wasteland, littered with the corpses of those who had once stood against him. His army of elders waited silently behind him, their pale faces turned toward him in unwavering loyalty. They were his now, an unstoppable force that would sweep across the world, laying waste to everything in their path. The sage raised his arms, embracing the storm that raged above. Lightning cracked through the sky, illuminating his figure like a demonic deity standing at the edge of the apocalypse. The storm was a herald of the destruction to come, a sign of the chaos that would soon engulf the world. He smiled, his face twisted with malice. "This is only the start," he whispered, his voice drowned out by the roar of thunder. "Soon, the world will know the wrath of the sage." As the winds howled and the sky rumbled above, the sage stood tall, his heart filled with hatred and fury. The world of man, once safe in the balance of shadow and light, was now teetering on the edge of oblivion, and he, the sage, would be the one to push it over. Nothing could stop him now. The end begins. The world trembled as the sage's army of elders marched forward, leaving destruction in their wake. The balance that once held the supernatural and mortal realms together teetered on the edge of collapse. Cities would fall, kingdoms would crumble, and soon nothing would be left to stop the tide of darkness. But could anything stand in the way of the sage and his unstoppable legion? Could the world be saved from annihilation, or was it doomed to fall under the weight of its own imbalance? The storm raged on, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. Part 2, coming soon. Can anything stop the sage and his army of elders? Or will the balance be destroyed forever? Find out in Part 2, only here at Professor Shadow.
each of us hold incredible power. Power to be anything we choose to be. The power to shape our reality or pursue the courage of our actions and dreams. But too often, we surrender that power. We blame others for our failures and the obstacles in our path, and for the dreams we never cared to chase. Yet the truth is simple. No one can take from us what we do not give. No one has the power to steal our strength, our ambitions, unless we freely give it to them. The sage understood this better than anyone. He believed every individual is a force of nature, capable of great things when we stand firm in our purpose. But even he, someone so wise, fell victim to the darkness, letting his power slip into the hands of others. Tonight, we delve into his story, a story of one who sought to protect the balance. The tale of the sage reminds us that we are all our own highest priority in our own lives, and that the only real battle is that within ourselves. So as you listen to the sage's tale, ask yourself, what are you truly capable of when you do not let others steal your light?
The sage's origin. The sage stood before his army of elders, a vast sea of glowing eyes and pale faces, their power palpable in the cold night air. Normally, elders were fiercely independent, each bound by their own will, desires and ambitions. They were not pack-minded creatures, nor did they follow commands easily, but under the sage's influence, they were united, compelled to do his bidding. Such dominance was unheard of in the vampire world. There had never been an elder like the sage. He was not just another victim of vampirism. His transformation had been deliberate, with a purpose far greater than himself. Before becoming what he was now, the sage had been a man of extraordinary intellect, a scholar whose wisdom was unmatched. Even as a mortal, he was known by the name Mephion, a name that evoked strength and confidence in wisdom, and it was that wisdom that would shape his destiny. The scene shifted back in time to the early 13th century, in the heart of a crumbling European empire. Mephion sat in the grand library of an ancient castle, surrounded by shelves, stacked with tomes of knowledge and scrolls of ancient wisdom. His face was calm, thoughtful, as he studied an old manuscript, with eyes that saw far beyond the words on the page. Across from him sat Kalen, an elder vampire whose presence commanded respect. Kalen was old, older than most, and his name, meaning mighty warrior, was a testament to the strength he once held. But now, Kalen had long since traded his physical strength for the sharpness of his mind. He had seen the world, both the world of men and the world of elders, and he had witnessed its corruption. "Mephion," Kalen began, his voice low and grave, "there is a sickness spreading through both our worlds. Man and elder alike are driven by greed, each taking what they can for their own benefit, without thought for the consequences. The rulers of men steal from those who work hardest, bleeding their people dry, while elders prey upon the weak, feeding without restraint. I see corruption everywhere, and if it continues unchecked, it will bring about the end of all things." Mephion set down the manuscript and regarded Kalen thoughtfully. "Greed is not confined to man or elder," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It is the nature of the weak to take from those who produce more, to tear down those who achieve, and to strip away what is earned by effort. Men seek to steal from the highest producers and give to those who produce nothing, all under the guise of justice. Elders, too, take without thought, feeding endlessly from the weak, offering nothing in return. Corruption festers when the strong are forced to support the weak, when the individual is sacrificed for the sake of the collective. Kalen nodded, his expression grim. And you believe this corruption can be stopped? Mephion's gaze hardened. I believe that the only true path is for each individual to strive to be their best self, to rely on no one else, and to demand no unearned rewards. When others seek to steal from the individual, whether by force or through deceit, that is when corruption takes root. The individual is the most powerful force in the world, but both men and elders seek to strip away that power, to drain it for their own gain. Kalen's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. You speak of strength, of self-reliance, but you also see what I see, do you not? This imbalance, this unchecked greed, will not stop on its own. If left unchecked, it will destroy both the world of men and the world of elders. Mephion paused for a moment, weighing Kalen's words. Normally, he began, I would not sacrifice my time or energy for the sake of another. My highest priority is myself, my needs, my growth. I do not concern myself with the whims or weaknesses of others, but... His voice trailed off, and his eyes met Kalen's. This imbalance you speak of, it will not only destroy them, it will eventually harm me as well. If the world is torn apart, there will be nothing left for even the strongest to survive. So yes, I will help, but know this, I do so for my own sake, not for theirs. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Kalen's lips. That is more than enough, Mephion. With your wisdom, we can stop the destruction that is coming. You are the one who can restore the balance, both for men and for elders. And in doing so, you may yet save yourself. Mephion's gaze remained steady, but within him a decision had been made. He understood the truth of Kalen's words. The balance that held the world together was fragile, and while he would never sacrifice himself for the sake of others, he would do what was necessary to ensure his own survival. The corruption of the weak would eventually infect even the strongest, and that he could not allow. You will have my help, Mephion said at last. But this balance, if it is to be restored, must be done without forcing others to bend to the will of the collective. Each being must learn to stand on their own, to embrace their own strength. If they fail to do so, then the destruction they bring upon themselves is deserved. Kalen nodded slowly. You are the one, Mephion, the elder who can guide us through this storm. The scene shifted back to the present. The sage, once known as Mephion, now stood as a being of unimaginable power. His golden eyes swept over his army of elders, creatures who had once been free-thinking, but were now bound to his will. The individualism he once cherished had been consumed by the dark power that now coursed through him, twisting his philosophy into a singular desire for dominance. As the storm rumbled overhead, the sage looked skyward, his lips curling into a smile. This was just the beginning. This is but the start, he whispered to the heavens, his voice filled with fury. Soon the world will know the wrath of the sage. And the balance he had once sought to preserve would be shattered forever. The sage's army swept across the known lands like a black plague. Villages crumbled, cities were reduced to ash, and fields that once sustained life now lay barren, soaked with the blood of the fallen. The humans fought back with everything they had, but it was in vain. The elders, bound to the sage's command, moved with terrifying precision, their power unstoppable, their hunger insatiable. Each conquest left the world darker, emptier, as if mankind had no hope, no future. It was as if the very essence of life itself was being drained from the earth. The sage, at the head of his legion, was a force unlike anything the world had ever seen. No man, no army, no kingdom could stand against him. His influence was spreading, and with each victory, it seemed the time of man was ending. The age of the elder had begun. The scene shifted to a land of utter darkness, where nothing grew, and death was all that remained. The ground was cracked and decayed, and the air itself seemed lifeless. This was no ordinary place, but a realm where even the shadows feared to linger. In this desolate wasteland, a voice echoed, a deep, cold voice that carried the weight of eternity. But no figure could be seen, only the overwhelming presence of death and destruction.
You think me a fool, Thorn?
The voice dripped with disdain. The unseen speaker mocked, as if addressing someone unworthy of attention.
Your father, as weak and foolish as he is, clings too tightly to the balance. He would never allow this to happen. You expect us to war with him? To make a place for you among gods?
A rumbling laugh followed, bitter and filled with contempt. The unseen speaker was not amused, but disgusted.
Fool. Your pathetic plan is like that of an ant trying to take down a lion. Your schemes are insignificant. You think you can manipulate this? That you can turn the world on its head and rise above your father's failures?
The voice grew darker, colder, a deadly whisper that could freeze the soul.
I will need to send but one to end your scheming.
The unseen speaker paused, as if savoring the thought of destruction.
Have you forgotten who I am? I am Necros, god of the undead. I control death itself. It is mine to take, or mine to give. Remember that, before you dare meddle with forces beyond your comprehension.
The scene shifted back to the wastelands of the living world, where the sage marched at the front of his army. His golden eyes burned with fury, his body pulsing with an unstoppable energy. Around him, the land lay barren, scorched by the wrath of his conquests. Nothing could grow where his army passed. Only death and ruin followed in his wake. His rage was endless, a fire that consumed everything in its path. Each village that fell beneath his feet only fueled the hunger for more. He sought his next conquest, the next place to bring under his heel. The lands ahead were empty, but the sage knew he would find something, someone worth crushing soon enough. The time of man was over. The world now belonged to the sage, and his march of death would never cease. But in the shadows of his destruction, something darker waited. Dr. Thorn stood on the edge of a cliff, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sage's army continued its relentless march. His lips curled into a smile, a slow, deliberate expression of both satisfaction and amusement. The destruction was unfolding perfectly, just as he had planned. And yet, Necros's voice, the god of the undead, echoed in his mind, mocking, threatening, dismissing him as little more than a fool. Thorn's smile widened. He watched. He waited. Necros, he muttered softly to himself. You dare to underestimate me. He knew exactly what the god was planning. Necros believed he could stop this, the rising tide of elders, the destruction of the world's balance, by sending a champion, some being powerful enough to defeat the sage and his army. But Thorn saw further ahead. He saw the flaw in Necros's thinking. When you summon something powerful enough to defeat the sage and his army, Thorn mused, his voice carrying a dark amusement, that will be the very thing that shatters the balance you so desperately cling to. He chuckled softly to himself, his eyes gleaming with wicked anticipation. And when that balance breaks, he continued, you will have no choice but to come crawling to me, begging for my aid, I cannot wait to see who you will bring to face the sage, Necros. What creature could you possibly summon to turn the tide? The thought of Necros, scrambling to fix the chaos he'd unwittingly unleashed, filled Thorn with a sense of triumph. The god thought he could manipulate the pieces on the board, that he could control the outcome. But Thorn had already set his plans into motion, far deeper than Necros could see. Even if the god somehow managed to overcome the sage, it wouldn't matter. Thorn had been working quietly, patiently, behind the scenes. I've already started to amass my own force, Thorn whispered. A special group of elders, handpicked and bound to my will. Elders who serve me, and me alone. And I am far from done. Thorn's smile grew sharper as he imagined the future. As time passed, more and more elders would join him. They would be drawn to his power, to his vision. His army of elders would become something far greater than what even the sage commanded, a force so strong, so unyielding, that not even Necros or the gods themselves could stand against it. We shall grow stronger, Thorn murmured, until we are unstoppable, and not even you, Necros, will be able to challenge us. He took a final glance at the distant battlefield, where the sage continued his conquest, unaware of the storm that brewed behind him. Thorn's plans were already in motion, and soon the gods would have no choice but to acknowledge his power. They would see him not as a threat, but as the inevitable ruler of the supernatural realms. Thorn turned away from the cliff, his mind sharp, his patience endless. He was in no rush. Let Necros play his hand. Let him summon his champion. Whatever came, Dr. Thorn was prepared. Watch carefully, Necros, he whispered, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. You'll come to me soon enough. And when that day came, it would be Thorn who held all the power. The sage's army marched relentlessly, scorching the earth, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The air was thick with death, the land barren beneath the tread of thousands of elders. But as they approached their next conquest, the sage stopped abruptly. Something powerful, something ancient, stirred ahead. The very earth beneath his feet trembled, and the ground around him began to shift unnaturally. He could feel it. This was not just another foe. This was something deeper, something tied to his past. The soil began to bubble, the earth cracking open as a hand, gnarled and weathered, clawed its way up from the darkness. The ground shook violently, and the sage stood motionless, knowing what was coming. A single figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness, indistinguishable to his army. But the sage knew. As lightning split the sky, it illuminated the face of the figure. It was Kalen, the elder who had once turned the sage from man to vampire, the elder who had placed his faith in the wisdom of Mephion, the name the sage once bore, the elder who had sacrificed himself so that the sage might live. Necros had returned Kalen from the dead, playing a move unseen by Dr. Thorn. This was Necros's answer, his counter to the sage's madness, a being more powerful than any other, a being who knew the sage's mind, his heart. Kalen approached with a slow, deliberate step, his presence undeniable. The sage's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of his old mentor. You are dead. The sage's voice was low, filled with confusion and anger. I saw you destroyed myself. You sacrificed yourself for me, so that I may live. How is this possible? Oh, Kalen's eyes were piercing, filled with sadness and disappointment. He spoke, his voice like a ghost returned to haunt the sage. What is this, Mephion? What have you done? You, who were meant to guard the balance, have become its destroyer. The sage's expression twisted with rage, but beneath it, a flicker of doubt. I did what I must, he snarled. The humans were killing us, disrupting the balance. No. Kalen's voice boomed with fury. You are the one who has disrupted the balance. You are the destroyer of all things. His hand swept toward the army, standing behind the sage. Look behind you, Mephion. Each one of them was once human. You have forced them to become the very thing you detested. A collective mind, a mindless force, driven by your command. The sage staggered, his mind a battleground. Dr. Thorne's influence twisted within him, fueling his hatred, feeding his power. His thoughts were no longer his own, but Kalen's words struck deep, igniting the wisdom that had once guided him. His face contorted, a terrible scream tearing from his throat as he clutched his head, struggling with the war inside himself. I am not in control, the sage roared, the battle between his own mind and the dark influence of Dr. Thorne tearing him apart from within. Help me, Kalen. For a brief moment, clarity flickered in the sage's eyes. He looked at Kalen with desperation, but the influence of Thorne was too strong, too deeply embedded. The rage surged within him again, and he turned with a fierce, predatory snarl. His eyes burned with wrath as he struck at Kalen's frail body, his hand cutting through the air like a blade. Kalen's body collapsed instantly under the power of the sage's blow, crumpling to the ground. But as he fell, his voice remained calm, and his final words echoed through the stillness. I do so for my own sake, not for yours. Kalen's body hit the ground, lifeless, and the weight of his words hit the sage like a physical blow. They were the words the sage had once spoken, the philosophy he had lived by. I do so for my own sake. And now, in his madness, he had betrayed those very words. He had turned his back on everything he once stood for. The sage stumbled, the realization crashing over him like a wave. He collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping the cold earth as if to steady himself from the truth he could no longer deny. I am the sage, he whispered, his voice trembling. I am the savior of the balance. The words rang, hollow at first, lost in the wind, but he repeated them, louder, more forceful. I am the sage, the savior of the balance. His voice cracked, but each repetition brought a flicker of clarity, a crack in the darkness that had clouded his mind for so long. Finally, the rage that had consumed him began to subside. His breath steadied, and he looked up at the sky, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a shroud. The once vibrant world was now a barren wasteland, the army behind him a twisted remnant of what was once human life. A single tear fell from the sage's eye, tracing a path down his face before dropping into the dark earth. It was absorbed instantly, as if the very ground mourned with him. What have I done? He whispered, his voice barely audible against the howling wind. And in that moment, the sage, once Mephion, the guardian of balance, was left alone, surrounded by the ruins of his own making. I am the sage. His voice thundered across the barren land, the remnants of Dr. Thorne's influence shattering under the sheer force of his will. A wave of pure energy exploded from his body, sending ripples through the air. His army of elders, thousands strong, stood motionless, their once glowing eyes now dim, awaiting their master's command. The sage approached them slowly, his gaze filled with sorrow and regret. His voice, once filled with fury, now trembled with the weight of his realization. I have done the very thing I swore never to do. I, who once fought for the freedom of the individual, have forced each of you into a collective. I have taken away your will, your freedom, your essence. He paused, scanning the faces of the beings who had once been human, now bound to him by force. But no more, the sage continued. By my hand, you will be free again. Each of you shall return to the individual you once were. I will restore the balance I was meant to protect, not through control or domination, but by granting you back the power of choice." His voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "Know this, no man, no elder should ever live for the sake of another. You are the highest priority in your own life, for without you, the collective is meaningless. It is the strength of the individual that gives life meaning." The elders remained still, but there was a shift, a subtle change in the air, as though the very fabric of reality had heard the sage's declaration. His task was not done, however. He would need to go further, to undo the damage he had wrought, to reach out beyond his power, to the gods themselves. The ritual of restoration. The sage walked to the centre of the barren field, the land scorched and broken from the destruction he had brought upon it. He knelt and began tracing ancient symbols into the earth, each line precise, each shape radiating with ancient energy. He knew what he needed to do, but it would come at a great cost, one he was prepared to pay. With the symbols complete, the sage stood in their centre, his hands raised toward the sky. "Though my wisdom is vast and my power great," he murmured, "I cannot correct this alone. I need the help of those who see the vision of balance. When weak men come together in a collective to steal the efforts of others, let them tremble at the sight of powerful individuals working together to restore what has been lost." As his words faded into the wind, the symbols on the ground began to glow, pulsing with a deep, ancient energy. The air around him shifted, and 3 entities materialized before him, their forms swirling masses of energy and light. Behind them, a golden nexus of light shimmered, a radiant, swirling vortex of power that represented reality itself. These were the gods of the supernatural realms. Necros, god of the undead; Lysanor, god of the lichens; and Nocturna, the vampire god. They hovered before him in silent judgment. The sage bowed his head, not in submission, but in respect. "I have done terrible things," he said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Though I was influenced, I hold no one responsible but myself. I was not strong enough to resist the darkness, and in my weakness I became the very thing I despise. I took away the freedom of others. Even with all my wisdom, I cannot see a way to undo the damage I have caused, and so I offer myself as the sacrifice. For this was my doing. To live in this world as it is now is not living at all." The gods remained silent, their energy crackling with an unspoken power. Behind them, the golden nexus, a representation of reality itself, flared with light, shifting as if it were alive. Then, from the golden nexus, a voice emerged, calm, distant, yet filled with a timeless authority. "There is one," the voice said, echoing through the stillness, "but we are 500 years too early." The sage's eyes widened. 500 years? The voice of the golden nexus, the voice of reality itself, continued. "There is one who will be born 5 centuries from now, one who has the power to restore the balance fully. But until that time, this world cannot sustain the imbalance you have created. The cycle will collapse before their arrival." The sage's heart sank. His mistakes would destroy everything long before the one who could save them arrived. "Then, there must be another way," he whispered. The energy around the gods began to swirl faster, the ground beneath them trembling as the golden nexus flickered with power. "There is a way," the voice of reality said, "but it will come at a cost to us all. The balance can be restored, the elders return to their human forms, and the damage undone. But for this to happen, the gods must sacrifice their powers, and you, sage, will be reduced to a frail shadow of yourself." The gods, Necros, Lysanor, and Nocturna exchanged a glance. They understood the gravity of the decision. Without their powers, they would be dormant for many years, unable to influence the world they had shaped. But if they did nothing, the balance would collapse and everything, gods, humans, elders, would be destroyed. Necros was the first to speak.
We understand the price. We will give up our power to restore what was lost, and in doing so, we will cease to hold sway over this land for many years.
Lysanor and Nocturna nodded in agreement, their forms flickering as they braced for what was to come. The sage closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He knew what this meant for him. "I accept," he said softly. "I will become weak, but I will live to see the balance restored." The golden nexus flared brightly, its light washing over the gods and the sage. In that moment, the ritual began, the reversal of fate. The energy from the gods poured into the golden nexus, and in return, the nexus began to pulse with a power unlike anything the sage had ever seen. The world itself seemed to reverse. Time bent, reality shifted, and the very fabric of existence began to weave itself back together. One by one, the elders in the sage's army began to transform. Their pale skin darkened, their eyes returned to their human forms, and the twisted, undead presence that had dominated them melted away. They were being restored to what they once were, humans, free once more. The sage watched as his army, the very beings he had enslaved, returned to life. He could feel the power draining from him, his once great strength slipping away with each moment. His body grew weak, his once mighty form becoming frail and thin. He staggered, his breath laboured, but he remained resolute. This was the price he had to pay. The gods, too, began to fade. Necros, Lysanor, and Nocturna, their energy spent, looked upon the sage one last time. No words were spoken, but there was an understanding between them. They had done what was necessary, but they would no longer hold sway over the land for many years to come. As the ritual completed, the gods faded into the golden nexus, their power gone, their influence withdrawn. The nexus crackled one last time before dimming, its golden light flickering as it retreated into the sky. The sage, now frail and weak, fell to his knees. The once great power that had coursed through him was gone, but he was at peace. The balance had been restored. The elders were human once more, and though the gods had sacrificed their power, the world had been saved. A single tear fell from the sage's eye, absorbed by the earth, just as before. But this time, it was not a tear of sorrow, it was one of acceptance. "I am the sage," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "and I have restored the balance." And with that, the sage, now a frail elder, stood alone in a world made whole again, his body weak, but his spirit strong, forever marked by the price he had paid. Dr. Thorne stood on a distant hilltop, the winds whipping around him as he watched the sky shift and the ground tremble far below. Something had changed, something monumental. His grin, usually so sure and sharp, faltered as a strange sensation gnawed at him. He felt the pool of energy he had long manipulated fading, unravelling before his eyes. He narrowed his gaze, peering toward the distant horizon, where the remnants of the sage's army, the mighty elders he had helped unleash upon the world, were no longer marching. Instead, they were changing, transforming back into the weak, fragile humans they had once been. "Impossible," Thorne whispered, his voice barely a breath. His eyes widened as the full weight of what had happened sank in. He had counted on the sage, bound to his will, to continue the destruction, spreading fear, chaos, and ultimately breaking the balance beyond repair. He had planned to rise in that chaos, controlling the fallout and seizing power beyond any god's comprehension. But now, this. The elders were human again. The balance had been restored. Dr. Thorne's expression darkened as he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms until blood began to trickle. His body trembled, not from fear, but from pure rage. He had anticipated every move, every twist in this game, but he hadn't foreseen this. He hadn't accounted for the sage's final sacrifice. "So, you betrayed me, Mephion," Thorne spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You threw away everything, the power, the control, just to return to your pathetic ideals of balance." His mind raced, trying to comprehend how it had all gone wrong. Then, in the distance, he saw it, the last flicker of the golden nexus of energy fading into the sky, leaving the land silent and still. The gods were gone. The power that once shaped the world, the force he had tried to manipulate, had vanished, sealed away by the sage's final act of sacrifice. Thorne's smile returned, but it was twisted, bitter, filled with a darkness that had never truly left him. "So, the gods themselves have given up their power to restore your precious balance. How noble, how foolish." His eyes flickered with a dangerous glint. He had lost the elders, lost his chance to reshape the world through the sage's army, but the gods were now gone, dormant, drained, unable to interfere. That fact alone filled him with a new, darker hope. "You may have restored the balance, Mephion," Thorne sneered, "but you've left this world vulnerable. You've created a vacuum, one I will gladly fill." The sage's sacrifice had crippled him, reducing him to a frail shell of his former self. The gods were powerless, and in the wake of all this, Dr. Thorne saw a new opportunity, a world without gods, where his influence could grow unchecked. "They will see," he whispered to himself, the rage in his voice laced with ambition. "They will see that chaos always finds a way." Thorne turned away from the battlefield, his eyes cold and calculating as he walked into the darkness. He still had time. His plans might have been thwarted for now, but he was nothing if not patient. He would rise again, this time not through the sage, but through new means, new power. And when the gods returned, if they ever did, they would find a world reshaped in Dr. Thorne's image, a world where there was no balance, only his will. "Enjoy your victory, Mephion," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "It will be short-lived. This isn't over, not by a long shot." With that, Thorne disappeared into the shadows, already plotting his next move. The dawn of a new era. Years had passed, and the world of modern man thrived, ignorant of the ancient battles that had once threatened its very existence. The cataclysmic events of the sage, his sacrifice, and the god's departure had been wiped from memory, not by time, but by the very force of reality itself. The golden nexus, the embodiment of balance, had ensured that humanity would not remember. Only the most powerful beings, those connected to the supernatural, carried the weight of those forgotten days. The balance had been saved, but only for a time. In each era, the balance must be tested, and in each era, a new reality must rise to face it. Now, in the age of technology and modern man, the shadows of a new threat loomed ever closer, creeping unnoticed through the cracks of reality, while the world turned, unaware. A new force stirred, one that sought to tip the scales once again. But reality was never without its champions. Just as the sage had fought and sacrificed to restore the balance, another would rise to confront this new threat. His name was whispered among the few who still remembered the ancient prophecies. the one the golden nexus had foretold so long ago. His name is Winter. In the chaos of the modern world, where the lines between power and corruption blurred more than ever, Winter would face his own battle. A battle not just for survival, but for the preservation of the balance that held the very fabric of existence together. Reality itself had chosen him, just as it had chosen the sage before him. But this time, the stakes were even higher. The Crimson Dawn had begun, and with it came the dawning of a new reality, where the balance hung by a thread. Winter was the one. His path had been set, and though he might not yet understand the full extent of what lay ahead, reality had already begun to shape his destiny. Just as the sage had been tested, so too would Winter. The world was not safe, and the shadows that lurked in the corners of existence were waiting to pounce. The battle for balance was far from over, for in every era the balance must be maintained, and in this era Winter would be the one to face the Crimson Dawn.